Well, this is something that all of us will remember for a long, long time. The miracle on the Hudson back in the spotlight with the release of a new feature film called Sully. That movie is showcasing the hero pilot's steady hand as he made the decision to land a passenger plane on the Hudson River. Here's his call to air traffic control.
This is Cactus 1539. Hit birds. We've lost thrust on both engines. Returning back towards LaGuardia.
Cactus 1529. We can get it for you. Do you want to try to land 1913?
We're unable. We may end up in the Hudson.
Calm as ever, right? 7 years after that flight, most of the safety recommendations for water landings have not been put in place, at least according to the Associated Press. We're going to talk about this with Rob Marks, a commercial pilot and publisher of jetwine.com. So, Robert, here's why we're talking about this today. The Associated Press took a look at all the recommendations made by the NTSB after the plane went down. There were 35 of them, and the AP found that only 6 of them were applied in some way by the FAA and others. And so before we get into some of these that were not applied, I just was hoping that you could give our viewers some context. After a crash happens like this, what normally happens? Is it normal that recommendations are made and then perhaps maybe not followed?
Normally the NTSB recommendations are followed because the FAA often looks at the NTSB as a very public organization, and part of the thinking at FAA is, hey, maybe we missed this. We ought to really take a look at this. But again, that's only when the decisions can be made within the agency. And what you're going to see on some of these recommendations is that these, would have evolved into decisions outside of the FAA.
So let's give an example of one of them that goes to your point that you made here. We're watching some animation of this plane. This plane that was flying from New York didn't have to have flotation devices on the plane because it wasn't going for an extended time over open water. So it's not required to have flotation devices or rafts. It just happens that this Airbus A320 did. And so one of the recommendations by the NTSB was, hey, listen, maybe we should put some sort of flotation devices on all planes, regardless of whether or not they're going over open water. And the FAA responded that it was leaving that up to the airlines. Why is that?
Because the FAA does not want to be involved in telling the airlines that they need to add equipment to their airplanes that's, 1, expensive, and 2, is heavy, which means that they can carry less fuel and maybe 1 or 2 fewer paying passengers. And of course, that's part of the miracle, I think, of the miracle on the Hudson. This is the luck that happened, that they just happened to have that particular airplane that day.
And we should point out it was freezing cold, so if they didn't have any of these flotation devices, hypothermia would be a major issue for some of these passengers.
Absolutely.
And instead everybody survived. Do you think it is I understand your point about the FAA not wanting to get involved with some of the big businesses that are the airlines, but do you think it makes sense that airplanes do have some sort of flotation device regardless of where you're flying?
Well, I think you have to make a decision that when you look at the places that domestic airlines fly here, I mean, most of the time they're not over water at an altitude as low as where 1549 was. So it's a very, very rare possibility that they could be used. And the airlines are saying, hey, come on, give me a break.
Okay.
Spend all that money.
Yeah, right. And so that's what they're taking into consideration. Let me ask you about this other recommendation. Right now, pilots have a checklist if there's engine failure at, let's say, 20,000 feet. But these pilots obviously couldn't go through that checklist. By the time they were going through the checklist, they were actually already in the water because they had engine failure at 2,000 feet instead of 20,000 feet. So the NTSB said there should be some requirements in place for pilots to have a checklist at lower altitude. And that's another one where the FAA said that they weren't going to require that. Why is that?
Well, that's an interesting one because I have to admit I even wondered about that one myself. I mean, the practical aspect of the checklist was to figure out how to get the engine started if they would do that. And they didn't have enough speed. You need air through the motors, and that requires a steep dive, and they didn't have the time for that. But is there another checklist they could use at low altitude? I guess that would be a recertification issue that they'd have to pin on the manufacturers, the Boeings, the Airbuses, and FAA probably doesn't want to take that stand.
I only have a quick moment here, but what do you think is the big lesson we learned from 7 years ago and what Captain Sully was able to do?
Oh my gosh, were those people well trained? But also I think the most important lesson is that We can't train pilots how to solve every problem, and we just need really good people up there that can analyze and make a decision when they're forced to do it.
And he did it, and we're looking at some images of him. So interesting to look through this list. Rob, great to have you on the program yet again. We look forward to having
Thanks
you back.
for having me,
Thank
Jenna.
you.